What's up, guys? Welcome back to the library. Welcome back to another beautiful day in Bourbon Country and the Professor Bourbon Podcast. How are we doing tonight, Professor?
It's a beautiful day here. It was mid 60s. The sky was as blue, crystal clear blue, no humidity. Took the grandson to t-ball practice, watched him run around and do what 5-year-olds do at t-ball practice, which was dig in the dirt and throw their gloves at each other. So it was more or less playground time and a lot less t-ball time, but that's the nature of t-ball practice for little kids. You met him last week on the podcast. For those of you who watch it on,
Yeah, Brendan's the best, and no better way to round out a good day like that than with a glass of bourbon. So what does the professor have in his glass tonight?
today we're sipping Baker's Baker 7 that was barreled in 12. And I should say, instead of 12, I should say December of 2013. It was 7 years and 3 months. I picked this up a while ago. These things have been popping up almost everywhere I go. I see Bakers just kind of randomly with the different labels on them, and I really enjoy a Baker's. It's funny. We've talked before. I don't think I own anything that says Jim Beam on it, but some of my favorite expressions all come from Beam. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I'm a Baker's is always a good pour. How about you? What you sipping on tonight?
Again, I have another Maker's Mark private barrel selection. This one's from Cumming Beverage Mart in Georgia. I just barely had a pour left of it, so decided to go ahead and do a little bottle kill tonight. I know we've talked about those Maker Mark private barrels before. They really don't make a bad one that I've had thus far. So anytime I've seen a store that has a private selection for those, I try to grab one. And I know last week we had kind of mentioned that Maker's Mark does something a little bit different with aging their barrels, and that we go into a little more detail about that. So I'll let you kind of take over and explain how Maker's Mark kind of does things a little bit different when it comes to aging their barrels.
Yeah, and I noticed you were drinking out of the Norland glass there. So, hashtag the Norland glasses. Those things are beautiful, double walled, Borslite hand blown glasses. They really, if you want to treat yourself and get a glass that actually makes the bourbon taste even different than the Glencairn glasses, those Norland glasses are really great. In fact, before I do the Makers thing, is a friend of mine this weekend, he thought I was kidding with him when I was teaching him to sip bourbon, and I gave him this glass, and he picks it up. He goes, "That's a little baby glass." I said, "No, that's not a little baby glass. That's a sipping glass." And then we walked him through it, and he thought we were pulling his leg the whole way through. And then he's like, "Well, you weren't pulling my leg." I said, "I don't have time to pull your leg when we're sipping bourbon." So, yeah, Makers does things to understand why Makers are a little bit different. Think about rickhouses in general and the aging of bourbon. Once the bourbon goes in the barrel, it's going to sit in the barrel for a while, and that to store it, they put it in giant rickhouses or rack houses, and those things are pretty intricate if you think about the way they have to be put together and the way they have to be loaded and unloaded, because a lot of them are built with timbers. The old ones were built with timbers and put together very precariously, and they had to be loaded and taken apart and unloaded in very specific ways, so the weight distribution of the barrels didn't shift and knock down the rick houses. So you have rick houses that can be 4, 5, 6 stories high, and as you might imagine, in Kentucky in the winter or the summer, the top floors get really hot or really cold, and the bottom floors don't fluctuate quite so much. And you might ask, why does that matter much? And for people that know bourbon and aging, it seems obvious, but for those of us that didn't or don't, it's not quite so obvious. Is when things heat up, and this is where you're going to get the professor part, so the class might want to listen closely to this. When things heat up due to the ideal gas law, as things heat up, pressure builds, and as things get cold, pressure reduces. So that's why in the winter, your tire pressure in your car is probably a little bit lower than it is in the summer, and so the heat causes pressure to rise. And as the pressure rises, the air and what's in the air, which is water and bourbon and the whiskey and alcohol, tries to push its way out of the barrel. And then when it gets cold, it the opposite happens. The pressure comes in, and as the pressure comes in, because those barrels are sealed, it creates a partial vacuum. And when it creates that partial vacuum, it pulls the whiskey back out of the wood. And this breathing of the whiskey is what a lot of what gives it the flavor. And you might imagine on the top of a rick house, that's 50, 60, 70 feet above the ground and covered in a tin roof in Kentucky in the middle of the summer, is going to be hot as hell. And so it's really trying to get out. And then you go into the winter, it's going to be cold as hell. And it's going to try to be getting back in, whereas way down on the bottom, it might be warm and cool, but it's never really going to be hot and cold like it is on the top floors. And then the middle a little bit less. And that aging causes the barrels to age differently on different floors. And with more intense, that's a weird way to put it, more intense aging on the top floors and less intense aging on the bottom. So one of the things that Maker's Mark does in their rick houses to avoid that is they rotate the barrels. So they move the barrels from lower to higher and higher to lower, and they move them around in their rick houses so that they all age roughly at the same rate and the same way. And that allows them to get a more consistent product. Because, I mean, they've been, until, not 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they made one expression. And that's what they did. And they saved bourbon from the clear liquor debacle of the 60s and 70s, along with the Blanton's single barrel and the Japanese buying Blanton's up like it was their job. But Makers basically was it. There was, I think we mentioned this one before, is they had an ad that says "Taste expensive because it is," and they've been making the same product pretty much unabated since their founding, the Samuels family founding. So that's what Makers does. And then on another kind of end, you have Four Roses that only has single story rick houses, or I think they call them flat houses, I think is right. And a single story rick house, you're not going to have as much variation. They might be 4 barrels tall, and you're not going to get as much variation in that room as you would in the ones that are multiple stories with 16, 18, 20, 30 barrels high. So you're going to get a lot less change in the aging rate in that, and that allows them to control it a little bit more. But as you might imagine, it's a little bit more expensive venture because you have to build more rick houses to age the same amount of barrels, because you got to put more sides and a roof every time you build it. It's not just up with the same roof, just 4 sides as you get taller. So that's part of what makes Makers so consistent, so good. And I think we've mentioned it before. Almost every time we put Makers in a blind, it managed to find its way into the, in a blind of 4 or 5, it manages to find its way to the first or second spot in almost all of our tastings. But be that as it may, it's almost never the first thing we reach for. And it's kind of weird if you think about it.
And that's one of the things that's kind of unique about Kentucky that everyone talks about, is not only does it sit on that limestone shelf that gives them that phenomenal water that they use to make the bourbon into, but the temperature change. They have really cold, harsh winters and really hot summers. And so it helps with that fluctuation in those barrels. Whereas a place like Texas, I feel like it has a little bit of a different flavor because it doesn't get nearly as cold in the winter as it does up in Kentucky, or may not get the snowfall and things like that. So it's kind of interesting how all of that in the aging process kind of has an effect on the bourbon inside, which is really cool.
Yeah, no doubt. And Texas is known for, in some ways, rapid aging, because the whiskey's trying to get out of the barrel from the time they barrel it. It just wants out in the Texas heat. So you get a lot of real rich, dark, rich flavors out of Texas whiskeys, and most of them tend to be pot stilled, so you get that oily thing. And I think a lot of Texas whiskeys are an acquired taste. I enjoy the hell out of Texas whiskeys, especially Still Austin, and the Garrison brothers, by the way, are alumni of the place where I teach. So I got to give the shout out to the Garrison brothers whenever possible. So yeah, the aging is really interesting. It's a big part of that. And as I said, I talked to my food chemist buddy today. When baseball season's over, he's ready to come on and talk to us about chemistry of bourbon and food and the chemicals and all that. So that should be fun.
Yeah, I like Texas whiskey. It's definitely got a different flavor, and I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the aging process and the heat. But that also helps explain to some people that might wonder, why isn't there a lot of bourbon coming from my area? You might just be in an area that doesn't yield great weather changes, or the bourbon doesn't age well in that area, or maybe they just haven't quite figured that out yet. But we'll keep it moving right along. Curious to see what you found up there in your side of town on this week's scouting report. Again, we've been a little bit dry down here the past couple weeks, so interesting to see what you've seen up there in your ABC state of Virginia, or maybe on your travels.
All right. First, let me give a shout out. I'll tell you some of the things some friends of mine have found for me, and to give a shout out to them. I was driving the other day, and a friend of mine, Dave, we call him Pritch. He calls me and he says, "Hey, I'm in the liquor store. I see a bottle of Barrel Seagrass, $300." And I said, "Yeah, I think you'd like that. It's kind of sweet." He goes, "No, not for me. I'm talking about for you." And I said, "Nah, I think I got one at home. I was driving, so I didn't look." I said, "I think I'll pass." So Pritch is always looking out for me. I think almost every time he goes in a liquor store, he calls me when he sees something. So I want to give Pritch a shout out. And he thought the blooper reel last week was funny as hell. He was like, he texted me almost immediately, told me stop clicking the F and pen. Again, for all of you that heard that or whatever it was last time, I apologize. And I apologize to the class for annoying the hell out of her. And then I also want to give a shout out to my buddy Phil from Nashville, who found me a bottle of Booker's 2024-01 Springfield batch. And Phil's always looking out for me. I really appreciate that. And we got hooked up by chance last week in Charlottesville, so he got me that. And then last week I was in Raleigh, and a friend of mine came in. He said, "I'm bearing gifts," and he brought me this, a bottle of Weller 12, and it's
Nice.
I'm down to a pour or two of my other bottle, so I want to give a shout out to Jeff from Raleigh for hooking me up with a bottle of Wellers and giving me that. He has some connections with some ABC people in North Carolina and managed to get that. And he actually got a bottle of Lot B. No, I'm sorry, Old Rip 10 for retail because of that. And then one of the employees had, and I think he paid about $1,000 and got him a Rip a Pappy 15. And so I'm hoping someday he'll bring a little sample of that for me to have a sip on, or maybe someday I'll end up with a bottle of 15. The other couple of things I found recently is when I was down in your neck of the woods. I think I forgot to mention this again. Shout out to the Tap House there in I always forget the town the Tap House is in.
Fairburn.
There you go, Fairburn. I picked up this Rebel 10-year, single barrel Rebel 10-year from Lux Row, who I really like, and again, a great distillery, a great tour. I haven't had a chance to open that one yet. I got too many unopened ones. There's not enough days in the week to open them all. And then in my travels this week, I was in Blacksburg and walked in an ABC store and saw this Joseph Magnus Murray Hill Club sitting in the back. And we opened that up, and all the guys I was with in Blacksburg this weekend were unanimous on this is really, really, really good. Comes in at I think we'll have that posted up on TikTok soon with the tasting notes and the professor's grade. It comes in about 102 proof, and I think I ended up giving it a solid B. It's a really good, a lot of really good flavors, a lot of cocoa, a little chocolate. I actually smelled some popcorn on it. I don't know where the hell that came from, but it was really, really good. And then today I got delivered from Flaviar in a little bit of a mess. Kind of the seal was already broken, so I don't get to do my unsealing, and I'm not sure where to go with this. I was really excited. I thought we'd be sipping it tonight. I got a bottle of Blanton's straight from the barrel, and it's kind of leaking in the box. I can tell you this, when I opened the box, I was like, oh man, that smells like a rickhouse. Speaking of rickhouses, and I was like, oh, if it smells like a rickhouse, that must mean that, okay, the bottle's not broken, but the seal had come off, and I think a little had leaked out around the cork because of the jostle and the travel. So, but I got that going for me too, so I'm pretty excited about opening that and giving that a shot. So, and I know I'm scheduled to be down in your neck of the woods in 3 weeks. So you better pick up the pace down there. I don't want to come back home empty-handed.
No, we'll turn up the heat over the next couple weeks.
Mrs. Professor Bourbon just said that would be okay if I came home empty-handed.
I bet she did, but we're going to do our best to make sure that you're not going home empty-handed after this next trip. We got a couple weeks. I'm sure we can track down several good bottles before you get back into town. I did know you mentioned TikTok earlier. We did have somebody that commented on one of our posts a couple days ago. You were going into a little bit of the details about the history of the name of bourbon and some of the legends of where that came from. And so I know one of the guys that kind of mentioned something. I think his name was Jeremy on TikTok, had come out and mentioned something about the theory that you had been talking about on that TikTok. So I know there's a few theories about bourbon and where the name actually came from and things like that. So I was going to let you kind of go into a little more details about that and maybe defend yourself on that answer and kind of explain why he's also correct potentially.
Yeah, this is in response to at Jeremy Kentucky, who excoriated us on TikTok. Oh, I think I just saw the class raise its hand. Excoriate means to criticize vehemently. Little tongue in cheek, he poked at us and said, "Hey, that's not where the name came from. It came from the idea that when stuff was shipped in barrels, it said Bourbon County, Kentucky on it, and there's some part of the myth that says they would type Bourbon County, Kentucky on it so they wouldn't know it was whiskey in the barrel." But I can tell you, I got my story from a historian named Michael Veach, who is the associate curator of the collections at the Louisville Filson Historical Society, which I've mentioned my student before who's studying for a PhD in economics, who's working on the history of bourbon and went there and looked at the papers of E.H. Taylor. And again, he's on our list of once baseball season settles down to have on the podcast. And I'm going to get to see him again in the fall. He's going to present that paper at a conference we're going to, so we're really looking forward to that. But he's also Veach was also the archivist for United Distillers, and he wrote a book that I'd read some time ago, which is where I got this story from, called Kentucky Bourbon Whiskey and American Heritage. And you can look that up and find that on Amazon if you want to look at it. But he talked about the argument about, and this is, I got the story from him, the argument about where the name bourbon comes from. And if you go to anybody local distillery in Kentucky, if you go to distillery in Kentucky, they're going to tell you that the moniker, the name, derives from Bourbon County, once a part of a larger expanse known as Old Bourbon, which is in upstate Kentucky, or as Jeremy told us, in Bourbon, Virginia. But the Veach tells us in his book the timeline just doesn't add up. So the Filson Society, which is home to bourbon labels printed as early as the 1850s. The Filson Society is a wonderful place that you can visit and look at the archives, and you get an appointment. They'll let you poke around like a good archival place, and you can see my student took some beautiful pictures of some old bourbon labels, old bourbon bottles, and stuff like that. And he said the story that the name bourbon comes from Bourbon County just doesn't even start appearing in print until the 1870s. Right? And he said what he believes is that the name evolved in New Orleans after two brothers, and this is the part of the story I forgot. The two brothers are two men known as the Tarascon brothers, arrived to Louisville from south of Cognac, France. And so they began shipping the whiskey down the Ohio River on the flatboats to the bustling city of Louisiana. If you think about Louisiana, it's really cool. Louisiana, or New Orleans rather, in Louisiana is a major historical port city in the U.S., and it was a massive port. In fact, one of my colleagues is working on a paper, and we might work on it together, talk about the coffee house culture in New Orleans. And the coffee house culture in New Orleans is really interesting because the Sazerac House is actually a coffee house in New Orleans. And by coffee house, you think of a place before the internet, before phones, before that, where people got together and met to discuss business and things going on, and they would drink coffee. Initially, they were literally coffee houses, and people would arrive there, and that's how they would network and talk to each other. And they slowly turned into drinking establishments, and that's where the famous Sazerac cocktail was invented at the Sazerac House in New Orleans. So we're looking at doing my buddies looking at doing why were coffee houses important? Why did they develop? And things like that. So there's a real lot of cool kind of history here. But leaving that aside for a second, they knew that if they took their whiskey, put it in charred barrels, and send it down to New Orleans, it would taste more like French cognac or French brandy. So as I said, when it went down there, New Orleans is an entertainment district. Bourbon Street is the big entertainment district, and same as it is today. It was probably might have been a little more wild than it is today in the 1850s. I imagine it was a little more lawless back then. I mean, and the interesting thing too, just on a quick side note too, is all of the bitters and aromatics and stuff. A lot of those were invented by chemists, which we would call druggists, in New Orleans at the time, trying to find a way to add to cocktails. So there's a really interesting history of the formation of bitters at the Sazerac House. And if you're ever in New Orleans, I suggest you visit the Sazerac House right there on Canal Street, across the street from the Marriott. And you can do a tour, and they have a beautiful history, and they talk about the stuff, and they also have a little bourbon tasting, and the guy that gave us the bourbon tasting was fantastic. And I told him I collect glasses, and I didn't see one out, and he kind of snuck one into my bag. I wish I could remember his name, but I got a little Sazerac House Glencairn glass that's really kind of cool. So he said again, go back to the story. Veach argues that, again, as I said last time, people started asking for that whiskey they sell on Bourbon Street, which became that bourbon whiskey, which then became bourbon. And he argues that we may never know who actually invented bourbon, or even who the first Kentucky distiller was. So that's one story. There are some others, and one is the one that Jeremy at Jeremy, Kentucky told, which is that people ship their stuff out of Bourbon County, and they began distilling their corn-based whiskey, which eventually became known as bourbon. And the highlight, and they kind of highlight the role of the Reverend Elijah Craig, who's supposed to be often credited with distilling the first bourbon in the 18th century. And they argued that what happened is he had some old barrels he didn't know what to do with. He charred them to get the stuff that was in the barrels out of them, put the whiskey in, it tasted better. That story is probably more apocryphal than anything else, because it is very likely that those stories are also apocryphal, in the sense that people knew about charring barrels to remove stuff long before they were doing it with corn whiskey in Kentucky. And so that history is always interesting, because there's so many legends in brewing that's amazing. And if you think about, a lot of that comes from the idea, and if you just the stories and the idea of the Bourbon County is, remember, Bourbon County and Bourbon Street are both hails back to the Bourbon dynasty and the Bourbon House, or the House of Bourbon in France, which was the French the French royalty. And if you go to that part of Kentucky, you will see lots of French names of cities, not always pronounced like they are in French. I mean, as far as I know, you say Versailles in France and Versailles in Kentucky. So there, lots of cities are named after that. So that's another theory, and I think that's the theory that at Jeremy, Kentucky was feeding us. There's also the idea that it just straight comes from the French Bourbon dynasty, right? The idea that the French influenced early Americans, especially in Kentucky, and they liked the dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty, and they just named it bourbon. That's another theory. Again, given the date the Filson Society goes, where you don't even see it start referring to the 1870s, that's probably not exactly why or how it happened. There's some other theories that are kind of fun that we dug up, and I think the scout Doug did some research this weekend, and he found a couple of the ones that were really kind of interesting is the baptismal bourbon barrel. According to this legend, Bourbon's name originates from a humorous incident involving a Baptist preacher and a whiskey barrel. Legend has it that a Baptist preacher, disapproving of alcohol consumption, jokingly blessed a barrel of whiskey as a baptismal bourbon font or bourbon barrel so that he could baptize a child, and the whiskey inside the barrel proved to be exceptionally smooth and flavorful, so people later just called it bourbon whiskey. They wanted more of that bourbon whiskey. So the stories keep on coming. Another one that's kind of interesting is the borrowed bourbon theory, or the borrowed bourbon myth. It says that this suggests that the name bourbon arose from early Kentucky distillers who stored their whiskey in barrels labeled Bourbon, Kentucky, as a means of evading taxes. And they believe that by marking the barrels with Bourbon County, the tax collectors wouldn't know what they had in the barrels as they transported them and wouldn't charge them for whiskey barrels. So those are a bunch of the different theories about where the name bourbon came from. It's like how many licks, for you old timers that are listening to this, and maybe now a little bit with you guys, they ask the wise old owl, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? And he goes, 1, 2, 3, 3. So and he bites the thing. So we may never know how many licks it takes to get to the name of the bourbon, where bourbon came from. But right now, I think Contra at Jeremy, Kentucky, I'm going to go with Professor Leach and the Filson Society, and believe that it had to do with that. And I think both stories are plausible. And again, that's a big part of the fun of bourbon, are the myths and the stories that surround bourbon. So those are our kind of response to our sharp and harsh critics, our demanding audience, that we get to the truth and say it the way it is. I don't think that's ever possible with bourbon. You smell popcorn, I smell caramel.
And like you said, if you go up to the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky and you do a tour at all the different distilleries, each tour guide you have will probably link in some kind of story about potentially how their distillery has something to do with how bourbon was named, or they have their own version of how bourbon might have been named. But I think one thing that's very important to kind of focus on is how much pride people, especially in Kentucky, take from the name bourbon, because it does have those standards that it has to uphold to be a bourbon. I think we've talked about that in previous episodes before. But when you go to those distilleries and you go through those tours, and even though they might have some fun facts and some fun myths and things like that about where the word came from, they're all very proud of the product that is bourbon and how it kind of represents their entire area and their entire culture. I feel like they have a real pride that just comes with the term bourbon in general.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes people around here in the South call it Kentucky brown water, right? Because it's so associated with Kentucky, and it's so ingrained in Kentucky and has been for hundreds of years. And by the way, the class is getting snarky over there and says that's why I like bourbon, because it's like econ, a lot of bullshit theories that we may never know the truth is. Well, that ain't true. Econ is a science. Bourbon is a lifestyle. So the class can go over there and get an F on her paper and find something better to do. How about that?
That's a t-shirt just waiting to happen. That might be our first Professor Bourbon t-shirt. What was that? Economics is a science, and bourbon is a lifestyle.
There you go. Maybe that'll be the hashtag.
That's a pretty solid t-shirt.
There you go. Hashtag for our first hashtag. Well, at least that wasn't a complete shit show. I guess this one will be, economics is a theory or a science, and bourbon is a lifestyle. And bourbon is sipping. Now lifestyle is better.
Bourbon's for the sipping. It is a little bit theoretical, though. You are right with you taste popcorn, I taste licorice, they taste leather. I like this, I don't like this, they like that. This is great, this one costs a lot, that one doesn't. That's kind of the fun part about bourbon, is you get to have your own experience with it and kind of determine what you like and what you don't like, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. Again, we were talking about prices in the secondary last week, and I saw this article pop up on my feed today, how not to overpay on the bourbon secondary market. Well, if you decide you like it and you're going to pay, you didn't overpay. Because one of the beauties about every time you buy something, right? Every time you buy something, you know it's worth more than you paid for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have bought it. And the other guy knows whatever you gave him was worth more than what he gave up. And that's the beauty of exchange. So talking about overpaying, if you overpay, then that's on you, right? Not to say we don't make mistakes, not to say every once in a while we go, oh man, I got to have that new Elijah Craig or the new Larceny A124, and I get it and I go, but I didn't overpay. I just made a mistake.
So before we wrap up tonight, to kind of bring in last week's episode with this week's episode, you did show us that Blanton straight from the barrel that you had ordered earlier off of an online site. So I'm kind of curious to what your reaction is now that you've seen the way that that bottle came in the box with the seal broken and things like that. That all adds into that secondary and transaction cost that we were talking about. Are you satisfied with your purchase, even in the state it came in, due to kind of the restrictions and the availability you'd have to that bottle otherwise? Are you satisfied with kind of the whole process?
I could be more satisfied. It's a great question, but I know when I opened the box, what it smelled like, and I'm really looking forward to opening that bottle and what I mean. I don't guess a tenth of an ounce leaked out of there because the bottle was still the cork is still in it. A little bit dripped out when the seal broke, and I'm looking at the barrel and the bottle, and it's pretty much full. I don't guess there was much leaked out at all, and it's part of the price you pay for being able to get it. And I can tell you this, without having pulled the cork out yet, it is nosing incredibly well in a cardboard box, and I'm really looking for. I mean, it smells. If you've ever been in a rick house, there's something about when you walk in that rick house and you open it and the just the warmth of the smell just overcomes you, and it's just a beautiful thing. I can't wait to go back on the tour. We're going back next year. We got to go back next year.
I'm excited to hear what you think about that Blanton's, because I know for both of us, Blanton's is a special bottle. As you can see, I have the lineup over here over my shoulder. I think you're about close to completing that lineup up there above you as well. And so I'm very excited to see what this higher proof Blanton's tastes like, because we get a lot of crap from people just because we enjoy Blanton's and it has a special place in our bourbon life. But I'm excited to see how that high proof Blanton's kind of drinks.
I am too, and they did give you a razz and a shit on TikTok when the scout opened up a bottle in the annex, and they're like, "You got some Blantons back there?" And I just look at it this way: don't be hating, right? You're jealous. Don't be hating, right? And as we always say, and I think everybody who sips on bourbon says, is your favorite bourbon is the one you like the way you like to drink it, and that's one of the interesting things. And when the historian Veach said is, drink bourbon however you want. You drink it with water. You want to drink it with ginger ale. However you want to do it, do it. It's yours. Enjoy it. It's not my taste, but I mean, who am I to tell you the way you drink it is wrong, right? We're all in this for the enjoyment of it. And if you like it neat, drink it neat. If you like it with Coke, God bless you.
I mean, if you hear Mr. Russell talk about it, he'll sit there and say people that drink 130 proof, even 120 proof plus straight are out of their minds. And most bourbon junkies or aficionados, they kind of will only drink high proof bourbons. That's the only thing that does it for them. And you have a legend in the game like Jimmy Russell, who's coming out there being like, I don't know who could possibly drink something that's that high proof without diluting it with either a little bit of water, an ice cube, or putting it into a cocktail. So it is kind of funny that someone even as legendary and famous as that can have such a different opinion as some of these so-called bourbon aficionados, I guess.
And as the class has given me some grief about, because last week she made a pretty good joke about sending her out and transactions cost for bananas, and I think the most I ever paid for a bunch of bananas was $20, because she went out one day to the store and said, "Do you need something?" And I said, "Yeah, some bananas," and I gave her a 20. And I don't know the shoe leather cost in that is, I think I had to buy her lunch, I had to buy EKG lunch, and I think I had to buy somebody else lunch and something else. And like a bunch of bananas at this point was like $1, and it cost me not $1 to buy the bananas and $19 in delivery cost. And you guys think Uber Eats is bad? You know, $19 on a bunch of bananas is just terrible. And then she does point out, and I'm gonna have to admit to this. Yeah, you can drink your bourbon any way you like. I'll try not to judge you. I won't judge you, but if you eat a hot dog with ketchup, I'm gonna judge the hell out of you. And if you put ranch dressing on your pizza, oh good Lord in heaven, because all ranch dressing is adult ketchup. It's what you put on food when you don't like the taste of
both
food.
of those things.
What's that?
I do both of those things, and I have no shame. I have no shame in my game. I put ketchup on my hot dogs. I put ranch on my pizza. They are both delicious. If you don't want to eat my food, you eat your food. I'll eat my food, and it's going to have ketchup on my hot dogs, and there's going to be ranch on my pizza and whatever else I can put ranch on.
Well, with that, like, comment, subscribe at Jeremy Kentucky. Thanks for following us and giving us some shit about that, and we'll keep on going on that. And although we didn't say class in session to begin with, because this is another marginally amateur hour, maybe we'll stick it in there at the beginning. But anyway, class dismissed. Enjoy ketchup in your bourbon, will you? That was a good, short, sweet one.